We are delighted to welcome to Dayton the Senior Advisor on Humanitarian Issues in the Office of the Special Representative to Afghanistan and Pakistan in the U.S. Department of State. In the Clinton administration, she represented the U.S. government at the United Nations Children's Fund from 1997 to 2001. She has been a member of the board of the International Rescue Committee, which I have had intimate knowledge of for many years now, a remarkable organization founded by, among others, Albert Einstein in the early 1930s, since 1995, rotating off for her years in government service. She has served on the boards of numerous organizations involved in international humanitarian work, and she had a career in international economic research in New York, London, and Tokyo. Impressive indeed, as is she. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Maureen White is here.
Thank you very much, Nick. And I would like to echo Adam's statement about the wonderfulness of this particular event. I came last year with my friend Kati Martin, Richard Holbrooke's widow, and our other friend, Samantha Power. And we were here for 2 days and left, I think, completely impressed, not only with this particular event, but with the city of Dayton, and all that it has accomplished with its civic pride and its energy and its focus on all the important things in life. And so I am very happy to be here, alas, not with my friends, but to carry on with this presentation of the annual award, the Richard C. Holbrooke Award for Lifetime Achievement. I'm very honored to be giving this award, and I am particularly honored to be giving it to Tim O'Brien. I can't know that Richard Holbrooke had read Tim O'Brien's work, yet I am certain that he did. I am equally certain that he loved it, but more on that shortly. I am here because Richard was one of my closest friends, and the truest of friends for 25 years. I also had the great good fortune of working for him twice in my life. First, in the second Clinton administration, when he was our ambassador to the United Nations, I was representing the U.S. government at the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF. And the second time was in his final assignment as the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. He asked me, in the summer of 2009, when the Pakistani military had moved into the Swat Valley to try to extricate the Taliban's grip on that population. 2.6 million people fled the Swat Valley to escape the fighting. Richard called me and said, "I don't have anybody handling these issues for me in my office. I need you, and will you come down?" And I did, and I worked for him for the next year and a half on humanitarian issues in Afghanistan and Pakistan, dealing with refugees and those who were internally displaced by conflict and natural disaster. Some people might be surprised when I say this, but given his reputation, but working for Richard Holbrooke was a joy. He was, in fact, the best boss that I ever had. He was notorious for demanding a lot from his staff, but he never demanded more of us than he demanded of himself. And for all that he asked of us, he gave us more, so much more, in terms of loyalty and learning, of lessons in history and lessons in life. He had a terrible sense of the urgency about the work he was doing, and it was infectious. You felt you were part of something great and ached to work your hardest. One of my colleagues said after Richard died, "Now who will make me do my best?" As in all things, he had a voracious appetite. Richard's cultural appetite was equally large. He loved film and art and literature. The last book that Richard was reading before he died was Rudyard Kipling's Kim, which was actually set in Afghanistan. He loved essayists like George Orwell and Lionel Trilling, who he so often quoted, and poetry. His own book, To End a War, on the Bosnia Peace Accords, is punctuated with quotes from his beloved W.H. Auden. Tim O'Brien's writing is all of what Richard would have admired, not just because it is beautiful, vivid, and evocative, but because it conveys the horror of war in shockingly visceral language. And it does so through the haunted stories of soldiers whose stories end up haunting us long after we have laid the book down. And he would have loved it because it was about Vietnam. Of course, Vietnam was the crucible which shaped and sharpened Richard's diplomatic frame. His own hatred of war and his lifelong search of ways to prevent war and to end war started there. Richard Holbrooke entered the Foreign Service a few weeks after college graduation, and a year later he began 6 years of service in and on Vietnam, serving first in the Mekong Delta, then moving to the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, where he became a staff assistant to Ambassador Maxwell Terrell and Henry Cabot Lodge. In 1968, at the age of 27, Richard Holbrooke was asked to be a part of the American delegation to the Paris peace talks. Richard was no ordinary diplomat. He was a dirt under your fingernails kind of diplomat. He needed to be in the field, close to the war, to talk to the soldiers, to listen to people. He craved the tactile intensity of experiencing, even touching the anguish of it all. I know from the stories he told and others told about him, they plunged into the deep and dangerous to understand the dark underbelly of war and human suffering. And that is the essence of Tim O'Brien's writing. It takes us to that ugly place. It is unsparing in its search for the harsh details that tell us the terrible truths. To quote Tim O'Brien himself, you can tell a true war story by its absolute, uncompromising allegiance to obscenity and evil. That is a real triumph of his writing. It is a body of work that consists not of one or two books, some of which you may have known or may have read, the things they carried with him. When I Die, Box Me Up and Send Me Home, Going After Cacciato, and several more. It is a body of work that has deftly delineated characters and broken new bonds in literary traditions because it mixes memories and paranoias. It mixes mysteries and fears. It mixes ugliness with the kindness of people struggling with the worst of life. It is a body of work that is noble because it addresses the ugliness of war with sparse truth. I was glad that giving this award brought me the occasion to read these books again. I read The Beautiful, The Things They Carried, and I wish so that Richard was there. He and I would have shared a long, intense discussion of Tim O'Brien. Richard would have had a dog-eared copy and turned to passages he liked to read and read them aloud. Oh, what he would have had to say about this book, and oh, what I would have learned. And now I would like to welcome Tim O'Brien.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, this is the end of our evening. I get to kind of wrap things up. What an honor. I don't know how to articulate with the right emotion or language how I feel at this moment. I've spent 35 years being called a war writer, and I'm not. The surface of my books may well be war, but the interior and spirit of the books is about this yearning and craving and thirst for a world of peace, having lived through a war. I am ready to retire. I don't want to begin my remarks tonight by talking about Vietnam. I want to begin in the here and now. I am 66 years old, and I am the proud father of my first children, a young boy named Tad, who's now sleeping over here in a tuxedo. He's 7 years old, and an older kid who's just barely awake named Timmy. And I want to begin with an anecdote about these kids. A couple of years back, I caught the younger kid, Tad, in our bathroom of our house, peeing into a wastebasket. And not just a wastebasket, but a wire mesh wastebasket. And not just a wire mesh wastebasket, but a wire mesh wastebasket situated on top of a fairly new maroon carpet that we had laid in the house. Well, I was astonished. The kid knew better. And I said to him, "Why are you doing this?" And I'm ordinarily a pretty quiet guy with my kids, but there was a certain earnestness in my voice. And it paralyzed Tad. He turned back toward the toilet, but made it only halfway, and finished the job midway between. Over and over, I said to Tad, "Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this?" And my wife heard me, Meredith, and she came scampering in, and she took charge of the disciplining duties. I retreated to my study, where I kind of muttered to myself for an hour and a half. And after, an hour or so, little Tad came toddling into the study, and he said, "Daddy, Daddy." And I said, "What?" And he said, "I have two heads." And I said, "What?" And he said, "I have two heads." And I said, "What?" And he said, "You asked why I did it, and it's because I have two heads." One head said, "Daddy's not going to like this." And the other head said, "This is going to be fun." Well, immediately I had been conceiving of this, he was then 5 years old. I thought I was bringing up a serial killer or a juvenile delinquent. I imagined him at Huntsville, getting executed by Governor Perry. And but the respect I suddenly had for the sophistication of this two-headed thought really struck me. There's a tradition in our house that I'm a writer, and so not only do I tell stories to my kids, from books and so on, and Thumbelina or Hansel and Gretel, but on occasion, pretty much every night, I make up my own stories. And that night, as I lay in the dark, flanked by Timmy on one side and Tad on the other, I began a story by saying, once upon a time, I knew somebody with two heads. And in the dark, Timmy sat up and said, you're kidding. I mean, are you really? And I said, "Yeah, really." And Tad sat up on the other side and said, "What was his name?" And I said, "His name was Daddy." Both kids kind of leaned in simultaneously, kind of looking at my neck, looking for the stump of that extra head. Well, over the course of the next, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, I began telling them a kind of cleaned up, Ajaxed, sanitized version of a chapter in one of my books. The book is The Things They Carried, and the chapter is a chapter called On the Rainy River. It's the story of the summer I became a soldier, in the summer of 1968. the summer I was drafted. I explained to these two kids that that summer, before going to the war, before even being in the Army, was in many, many ways much more problematical and much more personally traumatic than anything that happened to me in Vietnam itself. I was in control. I could say yes, I could say no. I could head for Canada, I could head for jail, or I could head for a war. I told them I was 21 years old and I was opposed to the war in Vietnam. It seemed to me then as a kid, if that's the appropriate word for a 21-year-old, but it seems to me now as a 66-year-old that you don't go off killing people unless you're fairly sure it's the right thing to do. I told them that, you know, the best one could say about Vietnam was that certain blood was being shed for uncertain reasons. The bodies were for sure. The maimed were for sure. The widows were for sure. The orphans were for sure. The Gold Star mothers were for sure. Nobody disputed it on any side politically. But as anyone who lived through that war knows, the reasons for the war were at best suspect. Hawks at the throats of doves, smart people not able to make their minds up about the rectitude of the war, people at Congress divided, the nation divided, my own family divided. What do you do if you're 21 years old and you're told to go kill and perhaps die in a war that you don't believe in and that the country doesn't seem to believe in, at least in terms of consensus? Well, by this time, Timmy and Tad are asleep. And there I am, lying in the dark, flanked by these two precious little boys, telling myself for the up-zillionth time the story of that summer of '68, in which it felt as if I were bearing two heads. One of these heads, you know, situated, say, over here, was a lover of my country, a believer in sacrifice for country. My dad had been a sailor during World War II off of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. My mom had been in the waves, adjunct of the Navy back then. In fact, they had met in Norfolk, Virginia during the war. In a way, I was a child of war. On the other hand, there was another head up here, believing in all the same virtues of service to country and loving America, but also a head that wanted nothing to do with the Vietnam War, certainly not to kill people, and even more certainly not to die. I was 21 years old. I was terrified. And through the summer of 1968, those two heads endlessly confronted each other, challenging and mocking and debating and taunting and cussing, invoking God and the names of LBJ and Richard Nixon and Jane Fonda and Abby Hoffman and Patrick Henry and Daffy Duck. A whole litany of history going through my head. Now and then, these two heads would speak rationally to each other in the Minnesota dark as I tried to decide, should I go to this war or not? Other times, the two heads would be seeming to scream the most outrageous obscenities at each other, screaming the black and white kind of platitudes that were being screamed all across this republic of ours through the hot summer of 1968. I was not now telling the story to Timmy and Tad, but I was telling it to myself, as I will tell it again tonight when I go to bed at the Marriott, as I will tell it tomorrow night and the night thereafter, until probably the day I die. Now and then, one of these heads might score a sterile, rhetorical victory. And at other times, the other head will win the day. Sometimes one head might say to the other, "What a coward you were for going to that war. You couldn't say no because you were too embarrassed to utter that word. Embarrassed in hometown, small town America, embarrassed to hear your girlfriend utter that word, your family." And then the other head will say, "Give me a break. You did what your country asked you to do." And the other head will chuckle and say, "All right. And what if my country asked me to blow up Toronto tomorrow? Do I just do it? Is that what we mean by patriotism? Anything? Automatic? Sacrifice your integrity and your conscience?" And the other head would say very sternly, "Come on. You live in a great and good nation, a country that would never issue such an order. Don't be ridiculous." And the other head will say, well, what about My Lai? What about the American Indian? What about weapons of mass destruction that did not exist? What about robber barons in pinstripes? What about McCarthyism? What about Hollywood blacklists?" And the other head will say, "Come on. Everybody makes mistakes." And the other head will say, "Exactly my point. Everybody makes mistakes." And finally, one of these two heads will say, "Come on. Let's go to sleep." And at 2 or 3 in the morning, I'll go off until the next night when these two heads began talking to one another once again. Well, it strikes me now on this wonderful occasion, an occasion that I would never have dreamed of 40 years ago, as I lay at the bottom of an irrigation ditch in Vietnam, listening to men die all around me, screaming the word mom and dad, and mommy and mama, and listening to the voices of the dying Vietnamese all around me as well. It strikes me on this occasion that it's important to give a bow to two-headedness, to the complications and ambiguities of this world that have to do with what Mr. Holbrooke was all about as a diplomat and what I think we are honoring here. We're honoring, in a way, a desire for common sense, to pay attention to those important questions of what we die for and what we kill for, if anything, and to find ways to avoid the dying for and the killing for, if at all possible. Part of being an adult, part of being human, I think, as opposed to being, say, a chipmunk, is that at certain points in our lives, we will all carry upon our heads 2 or more heads. It can be a curse. It can lead to wee hour second guessing, as it has for me over the last 4 decades, endless speculation about what could have been or what should have been. You in this audience may well find yourself now and then doing exactly what I do every night, lying in those beds, revisiting through a story or through memory a moral choice you made or failed to make or would make differently. 2 heads can be a problem, but 2 heads can also be the sign of an open mind, of a mind attuned to the world's pesky ambiguities and complexities and mysteries and uncertainties, of a person sophisticated enough to understand that knowledge can be imperfect and that one's own judgment may be dead wrong or may revolve or refine itself. To carry through 2 heads through life, however burdensome, however dispiriting, may help to avoid the soul-killing, people-killing mistakes of absolutism. Muhammad Atta, the hijacker and final pilot of one of those airliners that struck the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001, had but one head, a bonehead at that, an absolutist of the most consummate and deadly sort. Atta thought he knew the final and definitive truth of things, a truth worth killing for and a truth worth dying for. Let us not, let me not, and you not, commit the same one-headed sin of vanity and complacency and self-righteousness and demagoguery and fanaticism and zealotry and simple-minded black and white, you're right and I'm wrong, absolutism. After the events of recent years, I have come to fear that our own nation, as much as any other nation, is endangered by such slick, self-centered, absolutist rhetoric that erases our own national shortcomings, erases our own ethical and moral failures, torture, for example, in favor of a vision of America as somehow exceptional and beyond the norm. It is a great and good nation, and we can recognize that while also looking bluntly and directly at the facts of the world we live in. I conclude by coming back to that irrigation ditch that I mentioned to you a few moments ago. The month was July, the year was 1969. I was then had a rank of a Spec 4. Our company had been operating near where the My Lai massacre had taken place. It hadn't yet been exposed. No one knew about it except those who did it. And of course, the Vietnamese who lived through it. And in a ditch not far from where that massacre happened, about a year prior to my arriving in Vietnam, our company had been pinned down by heavy machine gun and mortar fire, and we'd taken refuge, many of us, not all of us, in a ditch that was, I suppose, thigh deep or knee deep, depending on where you were in the ditch, in slime, a mix of paddy water and algae and leeches and human waste. The stink was unbelievable. And in my dreams and in my waking hours as well, I can still hear the voices of those people, not just dying, but badly wounded, and the voices of the Vietnamese too. And at the bottom of that ditch, somehow, as this half-hour firefight went on, I became a writer. It wasn't said in that language, I'm going to write. It was more a feeling of somehow, some way, I'll bear witness to this. I'll testify. I will not stay silent. I will not stay silent after all the silence that I had exercised in going to this war, the silences that I had, to my great discredit, committed as I watched evil after evil and sin after sin being perpetrated. I would not stay quiet. For 40 years, I haven't shut up, and I will not. Thank you so much to Dayton, and thank you so much for an award that means the world to me. Good night.